Well, this is a wee bit awkward, isn't it? So the vast majority of videos on this channel are all about how I am, or was, a butch trans lesbian and all my feelings about gender. Plot twist! I was actually just a repressed non-binary gay man all along. Does that mean the TERFs were right? Ooh, let's find out. In this video, I'm going to go through the recent history of my gender nonsense, and then dig into the past origins and the future possibilities. Here we go. I'm detransitioning. So, how did we get here? For just over a year now, I had been having a gender panic, a gender crisis, let's say. I was feeling very, very weird about sex, sexuality, and all of that junk, which you will know if you've watched any of my other videos. I was getting extremely distressed by the fact that I couldn't regularly maintain an erection. I was confused by what aroused me and what didn't arouse me, and I just generally found the whole process of having sex on estrogen very stressful. You may know, I can't remember if I mentioned it, but I have a girlfriend now. We live together. I'll explain more about that later. But you know, we were having some issues, or I was specifically having some issues with stuff that was going on in the bedroom, and in the end, I decided to ask my endocrinologist if I could go on a topical testosterone gel. So that's basically just a testosterone gel that you rub on a certain part of your body. It was my stomach, it wasn't down there, because that would hurt, because it's like an alcohol gel. Anyway, rubbed it on my stomach, and specifically just mainly gives testosterone to one other particular part of your body, which might, you know, find it useful for having sex. So I started doing the topical testosterone gel on the 7th of June, and it went really well. I loved the changes, I loved how it made me feel sexually, and I felt really confident. And the idea of the gel was just to do a very small dose that would bring me to the high level of female range of testosterone. Great. On the 20th of July, so over a month later, I got my blood tests, and we were expecting to see that high female range of about 3 to 4 nmol per litre. We did the test, and I actually had about 17 nmol per litre. So I was very, very firmly within the male range of testosterone. And now I started to really panic, because I mentioned that for just over a year I'd been having these thoughts and confusions about sexuality. And there were many, many times where I actually considered, should I be transitioning? Is transitioning the right thing for me? Maybe I should detransition, right? And I always brushed it off, or I justified it, or I convinced myself I was a lesbian. But this was very clearly telling me, well, look, you are in the male range for testosterone and you feel great. Like, I felt so much better. I was hornier. I just had general body changes that I liked. I felt more alert. I felt more active. I was working out more easily. And I really wasn't feeling any negative side effects. So I thought a lot, and I considered maybe doing, estrogen monotherapy and just taking estrogen and not taking an anti-androgen, because the anti-androgen really didn't seem to be necessary. And I talked to my endocrinologist, and in the end, I just decided, you know what? I don't think estrogen is doing anything for me. So I'm just going to completely stop estrogen and gradually wean off my anti-androgen and see how I feel. I was on Decapeptyl, which is an injection. You get it injected every 3 months. So you basically have to wait several months for the anti-androgen to wear off. And during that time, I have been using the Testogel. But basically, as of the time I'm making this video, it has been just over 3 months since I stopped the Decapeptyl, since I had the last injection. So I'm basically off all hormones now. And I feel really good. Like, I'm really vibing with this. So yeah, so she's detransitioning. Whoa! Why did I transition in the first place? That's a complicated question, so I'm just gonna try and give, my theory. I honestly don't think there's a definitive answer. Like, it's really hard for any trans person to be like, oh, this is exactly why I transitioned. But let me try and piece it together. My main feeling is that, you may have noticed, even though I'm detransitioning, I'm very feminine. I've got my nails painted, I've got my hair dyed, I'm, hitting myself in the face and just, vibing and being very flamboyant. And that's the thing. Being a flamboyant, feminine, camp, gay man is fucking hard. It's hard. People act like it's just like, oh yeah, like the gay stereotype, blah, 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 blah. But to be honest, it's actually not that common these days. I don't see a lot of femme gay guys anymore. And if it's the stereotype and then you are the stereotype, like you look like the stereotype, people don't take very kindly to that. So when I was in school growing up, I was in the closet for a lot of it. But I definitely found, even when I came out of the closet, I still had to repress that feminine side of myself. I remember I came out in school and then like a week later, someone said to me like, oh, now that you're gay, you're like acting way more camp. Like, what's that about? And so I immediately like shut that down and tried to like, butch up. Not that I've ever been really butch, but comparatively to this. Hi, this is future Ariel here from the editing booth. The way I'm using the word butch here, I'm specifically referring to like gay male butchness, like butch versus femme for gay men. I know that's confusing because I made a bunch of videos talking about being a butch lesbian, which is a different thing. I honestly feel like my presentation was very much on that border between the two a lot of the time. So like you could have considered me a butch lesbian in terms of presentation, and I now consider myself a femme man in terms of presentation. But those two are actually quite close together, just like on different sides of the border between male or female, if that makes sense. Anyway, just thought I'd clarify. But as I got older, sort of after I turned 18, started going to university, that side of me really started to blossom. First in certain spaces like Esperanto events where I felt really safe and I was around accepting people, and then gradually just in my whole life. When I was 21 and in university, I really started exploring a lot like makeup, painting my nails, wearing dresses, wearing skirts. I was extremely gender non-conforming, and I got all of the fun harassment that comes with that. I got shouted at the streets. I had people slowing down their cars to laugh at me, people calling me chick with a dick, just all of that, just delightful homophobia and trans misogyny. At the same time, I was really exploring my non-binary identity, and I was very, very involved with feminist and trans activism at university. And the trans group I was involved with, like, let's be real, it was a toxic environment. There was a very close-knit group of us, and a lot of that group were in this one big polycule, which I was not a part of. So there was a lot of like weird kind of in-group pressure because of that. And it was, the typical like this was like 2015. So it was like the peak of trans Tumblr. So it was all like, your gender is absolutely valid, your gender is a feeling, your gender is a vibe, your gender is a can of Coca-Cola, cis people are shit, fuck cis people, blah, 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 blah. You don't need to trans or transition or do anything to be valid and all of that stuff. Which, like, look, theoretically, I'm not against any of that stuff. But it was kind of an environment where gender was this immaterial thing, right? It was all about gender as a feeling and gender as something inherent to you. Gender as your destiny, right? In this framework, transition wasn't really a decision. It was just the natural progression you would take as a person who is irrevocably, irrepressibly this gender. And to be fair, that's an idea that a lot of trans people still follow, and that is kind of the predominant idea in trans communities. I think it's why social transition and medical transition tend to get lumped together, because people really feel like, well, gender is this inherent part of me. So if I'm going to transition in one way, then I have to transition in all the ways, right? Because it's like living my truth and so on. So anyway, being in this specific environment, experiencing all this harassment, having experienced some quite, not awful, but certainly remarkable, like sexual difficulties and sexual trauma with gay men specifically, I was just at a point where I was sick and tired of feeling invalidated with how I expressed myself or my gender expression. And because I was surrounded by all of this like trans activism and trans talk, I really managed to kind of convince myself that, well, one, you don't have to have dysphoria to be trans, and two, that I actually was experiencing dysphoria. It was kind of like a weird combo of the two. To be fair, it was still quite a few years after that before I went on hormones, but I really had this strong idea in my head of like, I need to try hormones at some point, or I really was battling with that for a long time. Like, should I try hormones? Should I go on hormones? And by the time I actually did go on hormones, I had left university and I had to interface with the whole awful medical industrial complex, right? And the way it works in the UK is, if you go to a public health gender clinic, you're on a waiting list for years. So I had already waited all these years thinking, should I go on hormones? And then I had to go on that waiting list. And in the end, I decided to go privately and pay for it out of pocket. Not really my pocket, it was my parents helping me pay for it, but yeah. Sorry for wasting your money, Mum. But the whole system is like, you spend years and years like agonizing over it and working up to this point, and then you have like one appointment with a gender psychologist, and at that point you kind of already got it in your head, like, well, if I want to be accepted and I want them to give me HRT, I kind of have to play the role of the binary trans person. And even though this private gender clinic made it clear that you didn't have to do that, I'd kind of just internalized that narrative that I needed to present and act as a binary trans woman in order to have access to trans healthcare. So that's why I transitioned, more or less. And then the Atrophy Nation attacked. So, as I mentioned before, about a year ago, I started having this gender crisis. And basically it happened because the combination of hormones and an antidepressant I was on pretty strongly repressed my sex drive for a good year or two. And at first, I was really happy with this because, like I said, I'd had some kind of traumatic experiences with men, and I was sick of like trying to fit into the gay community. So the idea of just not having to worry about that stuff appealed to me. And honestly, I was very busy at the time. I was moving out of my parents' house. I was getting one of my like first proper jobs. So I really like was not thinking about it that much. But then at a certain point, I started to notice the lovely genital atrophy. So penile and testicular atrophy, basically cock and balls shrinking and not producing sperm anymore. And I knew this was going to happen, right? Like when you get HRT, they tell you, but it's just like one thing and like a long list of changes that are going to happen to your body. And it's one thing to read like, yes, you will experience testicular atrophy. And it's another thing to see it happening, to kind of feel the muscles like degenerating and to see the skin getting all loose because there's less like stuff there, to get painful erections because the skin is being stretched and because the skin has a different quality now in estrogen, and to not produce sperm anymore. And it kind of distressed me at first because I just hadn't really thought about it that much. And then I went on Reddit and looked about it, and everyone was like, oh my God, girl, use it or lose it. Use it or lose it. If you didn't use it and you already lost it, then you're a fucking idiot. So I felt like a fucking idiot, right? I really hate it when people on Reddit are like, use it or lose it, use it or lose it. Bitch. I'm not even sure if there's scientific proof of that. Whatever. Separate issue. But when I came off the antidepressant, which I think was like June last year, shit really hit the fan because suddenly I was having more sexual feelings again and I was getting super confused by them. Like, really confused, like distressed. Like, I... you know that I tried to like reason that I was a lesbian and stuff, but I was still like watching gay porn because that's always been the kind of porn I watched. And like, let's be real, straight porn is gross, lesbian porn is shit and designed for straight men, so whatever. And apparently there are lots of lesbians who watch gay porn, so I wasn't really worried about that aspect of it. But what I was worried about was like, why is watching this porn making me feel so bad? I didn't realize it at the time, but it was making me dysphoric. And actually, all the stuff with sex was me experiencing dysphoria. I was having genuine gender dysphoria every time I tried to have sex or masturbate or watch porn or whatever, because I was like, there is an incongruency between my feelings about my body and what's actually there. And I tried so hard to revive my sex life. I tried to like re-envision the way I imagined sex and the way I had sex and the way I fantasized about it. And to be fair, that experience of exploring my body and like relearning stuff honestly was really useful. In a way, like, I'm really glad I had that sexual journey because it served me a lot now that I'm detransitioning. But I had just spent years at that point taking stuff that weren't actually gender dysphoria and like reanalyzing them to convince myself they were gender dysphoria, right? I had repressed homophobia, like internalized homophobia. I had general body issues, like, you know, the gay community is pretty shit about body issues and just bodies in general. So like, I had always had issues about like being too fat, being too femme, being too autistic, at times being too hairy. And so all of that I managed to convince myself was like, oh, I'm dysphoric, and oh, this whole time I've been like derealized and depersonalized in the way I view myself, which is like, bitch, I'm just autistic and I perceive the world in a slightly different way. And also, like, if you don't like your body or you're dysmorphic at all, it's very easy to mistake that for dysphoria, but it's not necessarily dysphoria, as I now know. When it came down to it, what I realized was I want to be gay. Like, I'd spent years, like, kind of secretly fantasizing about being a gay man again. I want to have sex with men. And specifically, you know, I was imagining myself as a man in my sexual fantasies often, although, well, I was often imagining myself as like a werewolf, because here's the thing, right? Another thing that I had repressed was my kinky side. And I didn't really honor that as like an important part of my sexuality before. But what I've realized now is like, I am extremely kinky. Like, my very first sexual fantasies as like a 13-year-old were not even about humans. They're about like weird rubber monsters. Fun admissions on this channel, huh? And taking the testosterone gel and getting horny again, it was really the final nail in the coffin. And actually, it was like, it's really weird. It was like being on estrogen and probably mainly the anti-androgen. It suppressed my attraction to men, or it made it feel weird and dysphoric. But as soon as I went back on that testosterone, I was like, bitch, I am capital G-A-Y gay. I want to suck some cock. I want to lick an older man's nipple. I want to fuck men. Changes. So what kind of changes have I been experiencing now that I'm detransitioning? I'm glad you asked. The main one, the really fun symptom, has been hot flashes. Because, you know, having low estrogen and low testosterone, I basically have had, it's kind of balancing out now, but for a long time I was having the hormonal levels of a menopausal woman. So I was having a lot of hot flashes. I still have the occasional hot flash, but it's manageable. But it does feel quite funny where I'm like, get off me, get off the clothes, oh, I'm too hot. So yeah, that's a negative change. And there definitely have been some other like difficulties, you know. I have a non-normative body in that I still have boobies, although they are a lot smaller because like when you're on estrogen, you have like the breast buds, and you know, when you press down on them, they kind of hurt. But now on tea, like the buds have gone and the fat has redistributed a bit. So honestly, they're much smaller than before. I've also lost a lot of weight because I've been doing 1 meal a day intermittent fasting. You might have noticed I'm like super skinny now. But yeah, like, I can't believe I'm going to show you this. Before, if I touched my boobs, they often hurt. Whereas now I can just like absolutely destroy them, and it's not a big deal. They're just like little lumps of fat, basically. But it does look a bit, a wee bit non-normative. But hey, there are plenty of men with gynecomastia. So like, I think it's kind of cool. Actually, you know what's interesting? So many gay men I've talked to have been like, ooh, I like that. Ooh, I'm into that. I call it Crow's universal theory of breasts, which is that all men, regardless of sexuality, love a good tit. Because who doesn't love a good tit? Something to just grab onto, you know? That's one thing the lesbians have down pat. Anyway, so I've had that. Another thing I've struggled a bit with is erectile dysfunction, you know, as the hormone levels have been balancing out. It's been a bit hit or miss at times, which hasn't been great because classic me, I was like, I'm going to launch right back into having a sex life because I haven't been able to have good gay sex for years. So I went to a gay sauna, a bathhouse is what you'd call it in America, in London, and I had lots of sex, but my penis wasn't quite able to keep up with it all. Probably because I was like, it'd be like not working out for 3 years. It'd be like, I'm going to go work out for 5 hours and use the heaviest weights, you know, like really putting myself through the ringer. I'm sorry, Mr. Penis, I'm sorry. But on the other hand, a lot of the changes have just been giving me genuine gender euphoria. And that's the really funny thing. Like, detransitioning has really brought home the fact that, like, oh yeah, transitioning in the first place was not right for me because it was giving me dysphoria, and detransitioning is giving me euphoria. I'm going to be straight up honest because, you know, obviously I already have been in this video. Being horny more has been fantastic. I never thought being horny would make me feel so euphoric, but here we are. I love it. I just love it when I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna watch some porn, yay! And of course, you know, it's still quite early for a lot of the changes, but there have been some masculinization changes in the body, and I'm here for them. I'm really hoping that I get more fat redistribution, especially because I've been losing weight and working out more. I would love better muscle definition. I do have quite like a chiseled jawline now though, like not gonna lie. Probably the most annoying thing is the laser hair removal I had done on my face. I had quite a lot of sessions, so I really only grow facial hair like around here and it's pretty patchy. So I don't really think I'll be able to grow a beard for a few years at least, which I don't really know if I want to grow a beard, and it's nice to be able to like shave cleanly. I have noticed in the last few weeks though the texture of my facial hair has changed, and now I get a much more noticeable 5 o'clock shadow if I don't shave for a few days compared to before, and it's a lot rougher. And what about the atrophy nation? Well, here's the interesting thing. There is basically no research, or basically no good research about detransition for MTFTM people like me, detransitioning males or detransitioned males, when it comes to reversal of atrophy and fertility. However, well, I say there's no research. I think there's some stuff. Anyway, talking to one of the gender psychologists at my gender clinic, he said that some recent traditionally, they would tell trans women that like the atrophy is likely to be irreversible and that you are very likely to become sterile and never be able to produce sperm again. Recent research suggests that this actually may not be the case, and that probably the atrophy is largely reversible and there is a good chance I will be able to produce sperm again, which, yay! Not because I want to have kids, but because I fucking love cum. So the penile atrophy, I think, has started reversing a bit. My balls are certainly bigger. I'm like, every now and then I get an erection. I'm like, oh, gotta measure it and and see if it's grown, which is like such a weird feeling. But anyway, but it will probably take, at least a year. Well, maybe not a year, but it's going to take months before we sort of see a serious change there. There are a few testimonies online from MTF people talking about reversal of atrophy and producing sperm again. So it sounds hopeful. And I'm trying to keep hopeful and not despair about it. A non-medical change that's come from the detransition is it's brought up a lot of issues I had about being a gay man that I'd kind of repressed before. And it's kind of bittersweet because I realized these are issues I absolutely need to deal with. And I'm very happy to be a gay man again. But at the same time, as I've alluded to, I have a lot of issues with the gay community, especially with body policing and gender policing. And it sucks that I kind of have to still work through these issues. And I still feel this strong sense of I don't belong as a gay man a lot of the time. But I feel more attractive and more confident than I ever have in my life. So I guess transitioning did kind of help in some ways. It's complicated. And on that note, do I regret it? This is a hard question, obviously. Honestly, if I could go back in time and have the option of not transitioning, yes, I would not transition. However, going on estrogen did get me much more in touch with my emotions. It's kind of a bit of a cliche, right? I went on estrogen and I was crying all the time, but it's true. The way you process emotions on estrogen versus testosterone is pretty different. And I found it helped me work through a lot of my trauma that I might have still struggled with otherwise. Obviously, therapy is probably a better way to do that. But, some people have really deep revelations through LSD or something. So I don't see it as so different from that. I was using a drug to help me process my emotions in a way. And now I feel like I can process my emotions in a way that many men can't. It's very different on testosterone. There are times where before I would be annoyed or I would feel sad or start crying, where now I'm just anger, ugh. I've noticed if I hit myself now, before when I was on estrogen and I hit myself, I go ow. And now when I hit myself, I'm fuck. It's this rage just comes ramming in like a steam train. And I don't know, it's made me reanalyze, well, anger isn't necessarily this really negative emotion. It's just an emotion that needs to be processed in a slightly different way, right? But at the same time, I have to recognize the fact that I kind of have the option of not regretting it is really due to the fact that most of the changes are reversible for me. I never had surgery, and generally the changes you get from estrogen get reversed pretty quickly for the most part. Most detransitioners are FTMTFs, so detransitioned women, and many of them go on testosterone and have irreversible changes fuller body hair, facial hair, voice dropping, and so on, right? And obviously I kind of already had those changes because I had my first puberty as a teenager, so it's just going back to that. So in many ways, yeah, I'm very lucky. And obviously if I had surgery, I think I would majorly regret it. And I have read some genuinely horrific stories from people who transitioned as teenagers and had various surgeries and then later realized they needed to detransition. And then for them, it was this impossible thing. And they were always going to have this completely non-normative, essentially transsexual body. So I talk a bit later in the video about how I don't view trans bodies or detrans bodies as any worse than cis bodies, and I don't think they're broken or whatever. But editing this, I'm super aware that, wow, it sure comes across as if I think this is the case, right? And I think there's definitely a level of internalized transphobia there that I hadn't fully processed at the time of saying that. So I just want to clarify that there's no such thing as a broken body, just that these people went through, a lot of literally physically traumatic surgery that then can't really be reversed. Not that that makes them broken, it's just something that's very difficult for these people. I hope that makes sense. So I guess I am quite lucky in that sense, but I also just try to live my life without having like really deep regrets because it's not healthy. At the end of the day, it's something that happened and it was probably the best option or one of the most valid options I had at the time to deal with the feelings that I had. So how do I feel about trans people? Well, many of my friends are still trans. Actually, possibly the majority of my friends are still trans. My girlfriend is trans. I still love and support trans people. I think trans healthcare is, underfunded. Trans people are constantly attacked in the media. There's also this idea that, trans bodies are less than cis bodies. They're less worthy, that they're, disgusting or broken in some way. And this is an idea that fuels a lot of detransition discourse, the idea that detransitioners have caused irreparable damage to their bodies and their bodies are now never going to be right again. And I fully reject that. However, there are a few issues that come up within trans discourse and the trans community that I want to put a bit more of a critical lens on. Advocacy for trans healthcare in recent years has focused strongly on encouraging an informed consent model. And in some countries like America, in certain regions, this is already standard practice. And I fully get this. Informed consent is absolutely the easiest way for the greatest majority of trans people to get access to healthcare in a way that works for them. And we have to face the reality, right, that many, many trans people are, gonna figure it out all on their own and they don't need all of those hoops to jump through with therapy and so on. But I do think the problem is now in places that have informed consent, the therapy option is extremely limited. It's you can go to Planned Parenthood in America and get on hormones very easily, but can you get free long-term gender therapy easily? As far as I understand, that's not possible. I'm not really sure. The system in the UK is a bit different. But it was when I started going to this private gender clinic, because the public gender clinic was making me wait for years and years. Technically, I'm still on the waiting list for that, and I've been on it for 4 years, so whatever. I only had one session with a psychologist, and if I wanted to have long-term gender therapy to really figure out whether I wanted to start hormones, that would have cost a metric fuck ton of money. So I think promoting just informed consent and not trying to get free therapy is a tiny bit problematic because it's really easy nowadays to go online, immerse yourself in Tumblr and Reddit trans communities, and kind of convince yourself that you should medically transition when that is not necessarily the best thing for you. I know it's possible for autistic people, people with OCD, and other mental health problems and neurodivergences and personality disorders to really latch onto transness as a way of fixing your problems, and then you can enter these echo chambers of trans discourse and fully convince yourself you're trans without ever really discussing it in depth with anyone in real life. And that's a bit of an issue. We also have to consider that nowadays, there are all of these massive corporations, pharmaceutical companies, doctors, surgeons, who are trying to figure out how can we make money off trans people? I've heard stories where it's 10, 20 years ago, people used to sit in boardrooms and be how can we sell to gay people? They figured out how to sell to gay people. Now they're looking to sell to trans people. And what can you sell trans people? Well, you can sell hormones and stuff like that. And there are these ridiculous services. I think there's one I saw called Plume, where you pay a monthly subscription. This is, of course, only in America, because only in America could this happen. You pay a monthly subscription and they send you your hormones in a nice, neat little cutesy coloured box. And you get monthly sessions with your gender therapist and endocrinologist. So it's basically taking trans healthcare and turning it into a subscription system, which is just so that's obviously one way they're going to try and monetize it. And that's a bit silly and it's probably not going to work so well. But another way, and this is where I really start to get quite uncomfortable, is surgery, right? generally we live in the age of plastic surgery, and there are so many people getting aesthetic dental care, plastic surgery, and all kinds of procedures that honestly were not popular among regular people 20 or 30 years ago. And when you're trans and you see like, big trans YouTubers, it's really easy to convince yourself like, oh, well, maybe I should have this surgery. Maybe I should get that done, And obviously surgeons are going to encourage this because it makes them more money. Even in, countries like the UK, where theoretically trans surgeries should be covered under the national health, they often have really prohibitive waiting lists, or they only cover certain surgeries. So people often still end up paying for them out of pocket. So I've heard some really gross stories of medical malpractice when it comes to trans surgeons. Many people go abroad to get like cheaper surgery, which then can come with a bunch of other risks. And I've read stories of detransitioners who are trying to fix problems with previous surgeries or reverse them. And they're, talking to surgeons who really don't know what they're doing, but just want their money. And that really makes me uncomfortable. I fully believe that trans people need to have medical autonomy, but I think we also need to be really aware of the whole system that props it up. Because if it's autonomy to spend a bunch of money and basically like be like a vessel for surgical capital, that's not good. That's not good. I don't like that. A small gripe I have with trans communities online is they kind of become these spaces where just certain beliefs and truisms get repeated again and again. And I think it has consequences. So specifically, I'm thinking of when people say, well, cis people don't question their gender this much. And, well, if you're questioning your gender this much, there's a good chance you could be trans. And the thing is, like, in themselves, they're true. Like, you obviously can't prove it, right? But they're true, sure. Like, generally, cis people don't question their gender that much. And generally, if you're questioning your gender a lot, you should consider the fact you're trans. But what happens here is, one, people who are questioning can go in these Reddit spaces, for example, and read a bunch of these threads and see this thought repeated again and again and again. And for anyone with like autism or OCD, for example, it's really easy to just internalize that thought. And eventually your brain pares it down to, if you're questioning your gender this much, you are trans. Right? Because you're reading it, well, it could be probably again and again and again and again. And eventually it's just like, statistically, you see it enough. And I think there are certain spaces like Egg IRL, which can almost be used as like, I really want to be careful about how I phrase this, because I don't want to make it sound like people are like going out and like transing people and like it's like conversion and therapy or anything. But I do feel like there's this element where like, if you are in the right mindset and you have that kind of personality, you can almost radicalize yourself into transness by willingly going to these spaces again and again and reading about it and reading experiences and then just kind of forcibly applying that to your own life. I certainly know I did that at certain times during my transition. Like, I would be unsure about being trans, so I would go to trans forums and meticulously read a bunch of stories to try and find evidence to prove that no, girl, you're trans, you don't need to detransition, right? That's an issue. And then my final point, and I was going to say this is petty, but it's not petty. Whenever the issue of detransition comes up among trans people, the adage that many trans people bandy about is that, oh, well, detransitioners are such a small minority. It's like 1% of the 1% of the population that are trans. And this is based on a few studies where they looked at, they talked to like gender clinics and doctors, and they looked at the percentage of patients who had detransitioned. The problem with these studies is, I would say like the majority of detransitioners never tell their doctors. They just desist. They stop taking hormones, and they go on with their lives, right? And so these figures, first of all, they're not accurate, right? So I think it's probably more than 1%. It's probably not more than 5%. I imagine it's like 10% at the very highest, but it's probably less than that. But we really have no way of knowing just how many people detransition, and also like, when do you consider it a detransition, right? But even if it's just 1%, that doesn't make it any less important, you know? Transgender people are 1% of the general population, but I'm not going to stand here and say like, well, who gives a fuck about trans people? Let's ignore trans people because they're just a tiny minority. That's literally what trans people are doing to detransitioners. And it just really pisses me off because people act like, oh, these people should have figured that out. Like, there's often a lot of mockery of detransitioners, and the fact that a lot of detransitioners end up turning to gender critical ideologies or TERFism or any kind of things, that's used as a justification to treat them like shit. And I'm not going to lie, like, these people who detransition and then go on to spout these ideologies, yeah, they often are causing a lot of material damage. However, a lot of them have been through massively traumatic and painful experiences related to gender and sexuality, and I would hope that trans people, of all people, would, you know, understand that. There's also the fact that a lot of these people are genuinely radicalized and indoctrinated into like gender critical cults, and basically it's like a form of conversion therapy. And for them to be able to retransition and be like actually accepted as trans people, they need support during that detransition phase, right? Even if it's hard to support detransitioners, it doesn't mean you should just like act like we're shit and we don't exist, basically. I think it's also complicated because, you know, I'm a male detransitioner. There are far fewer male detransitioners, or at least far fewer open male detransitioners. And most of them are like straight Christians, so that's a whole other issue. But I do just get tired of this, you know, brushing the issue under the rug. I don't think detransition is this like massive wave and it's like in 10 or 20 years, we're going to see like, you know, millions of people detransitioning, but we are going to see more people detransitioning, and there are already quite a lot of people detransitioning. You go on YouTube, you look up detransition, what's the word? Stories, I guess, just people talking about their detransition experiences. And there are quite a lot of them. And that's of this, you know, supposed tiny 1%, who then, it's also a very small self-selecting group of people who are brave enough to actually share their story, right? And like I said, like, I've talked to some detransitioners and just heard absolutely traumatic stories about going on hormones at a very young age, having all these surgeries, and then realizing they wanted to detransition. And then they're like in this complete no man's land when it comes to gender and sex and all of these things. So those are my little criticisms. Feel free to call me a disgusting gender critical TERF and all that shit in the comments. If you do, I will either assume that you haven't watched this whole video or you're just willfully misinterpreting my arguments. I want to reiterate that I love trans people. I think I've learned so much from transition in general, and also just being involved with trans people and trans communities. I've painted a bit of a negative picture here in the last few minutes, but honestly, I found a level of acceptance and, you know, a space for exploration in trans communities that I didn't get in the gay community as a gay man. But there were still issues, and I've brought this up. As the crow flies. So, am I going to keep this channel up? Yes. I fully believe in just living unapologetically as the kinky, gay, flamboyant man that I am. And I think an important part of that is just showing my history. So I'm going to leave all the videos up where I talk about being a butch trans lesbian because honestly, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not embarrassed about it. This whole experience has just taught me that labels are a really useful way of explaining yourself to other people in shorthand and exploring your identity. But at the end of the day, they really don't mean that much, and they're kind of defined a lot by the person. So no, I don't consider myself a lesbian now. I kind of still consider myself transgender, but also detransitioned. I don't consider myself butch. I consider myself a femme or camp gay guy, right? Am I going to keep the channel name as Crow the MTF Bro? No, because I'm not an MTF bro, and I'm kind of still struggling with the name because I'd like it to have like a cute rhyme still. I was thinking maybe Crow the non-binary bro, but also like, I'm like, Ariel, you are not a bro, you are a hoe. And I was like, well, I could be Crow the non-binary hoe, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to call myself a hoe in my YouTube channel name. So, am I going to keep making content on this channel? might be. I'm not really sure. I've become really, really interested in queer history and kink history recently, so I might do some videos about that. I also have other thoughts to share about, transition and gender and kind of that whole space in life and society right now. But honestly, what I really want to do right now is porn. Like I said, I'm really just leaning into unabashedly exploring my sexuality, and I've always been an exhibitionist. I've loved writing erotica. I've made kind of very amateur porn before, but I wanted just do more sexual stuff and blah 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 blah. Obviously, that's not going to be on YouTube, but I do have a horny Instagram. So I have an Instagram where obviously don't post porn because it's Instagram, but I do post sexy photos, and that is called Spanky the Wolf. Spanky the Wolf on Instagram. If you follow me there, I will announce there if I do make any videos of a pornographic nature, and then obviously they'll go up on Pornhub or OnlyFans or wherever I decide to publish them. I won't link to any of that from here though. Well, I'll link to the Instagram, but I won't link to Pornhub or anything because I feel like linking to Pornhub from YouTube will probably get me banned. So let's not do that, sonny. There is kind of a dearth of resources for MTFTM detransitioners, especially gay ones. Although, I don't know, there are a few testimonies online from gay MTFTM detransitioners, but there's not loads. So I might make more content about that, but honestly, detransition doesn't feel like this massive important part of my life. And unlike when I was transitioning, I'm not going to artificially inflate it to being a massive part of my identity and try to make content based on that. But I might make more videos talking about body changes, and particularly I have this idea where I'll make a video where I'm basically just naked showing my body and just talking about hormonal changes, which again obviously would be posted on Pornhub. So if you're interested in any of that content, head over to Spanky the Wolf on Instagram, give me a follow, and you'll find out when it all is revealed. On another note, I've mentioned several times in this video that I have a girlfriend, and you might be thinking hold the fucking phone. Are you not a gay man? Is that not what this is all about? So my girlfriend is a transgender woman. We met in February before I realized I was going to detransition. I massively love her and we are in a very loving relationship, but I don't really feel a strong sexual attraction to her. It feels really awful saying that, right? Because it's you're in a relationship, you have to be wanting to fuck all the time. But genuinely, we have a very strong romantic and platonic relationship, and that's what we're happy with. So obviously we had a bit of a crisis when all of this came to light, but I spent a lot of time considering, and so did she, and we decided in the end that we were going to be polyamorous, and basically, I'm free to go off and have lots of sex on the side and find a boyfriend, and she is equally free to go and do whatever she wants. And I know some people are going to be excuse me, are you calling yourself gay when you're in a relationship with a woman? Should you not be calling yourself bisexual? You're misgendering your transgender partner, blah, 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 blah. Neither of us have an issue with it. We both agree that, yeah, I'm very gay and it just feels natural. And I feel calling myself bisexual would, imply that I have a sexual attraction to women, which I genuinely don't think I do. Apart from very butch women, but then I'm am I just attracted to them because they could feasibly be men? Low key. And then that's another issue, right? And I could call myself biromantic homosexual, but at that point it feels like I'm naming an obscure insect in Latin or something, and I just don't care for that. I'd like to end this video with a bit of a provocative idea, I guess. Traditionally, when we think about gender and trans people, we make a strong distinction between binary trans people and non-binary trans people. And when we think about transition for binary trans people, we think of social transition and medical transition often as intertwined. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but generally when someone starts saying, I'm transitioning, they mean both, right? And I want to challenge that and say, maybe for some people, they only should socially transition. Maybe there are people for whom socially transitioning, dressing and presenting in a different way is all they need, and that would be the best way to deal with their dysphoria. Maybe there are some people for whom medical transition would be the right thing, but actually they don't need to socially transition. They can go on hormones, for example, maybe go on estrogen, and still present as a man in everyday life and be comfortable with that. Basically what I'm saying is, instead of viewing transition as all of this stuff interlocked, we can view each of these options like clothes, social transition, medical transition, as just one tool in a toolbox of gender. And why does someone necessarily have to fully transition, change their name, change all their identity documents, and basically like flip that switch, when maybe someone could present as a woman in some situations and present as a man in other situations, according to whatever they're comfortable with? Now, I know you might be thinking, oh, well, is that person not just bi gender? But why do we have to force it into this box? Why can't we just accept that some trans people are not going to go all the way? And actually for some trans people, it might be much more comfortable for them to just explore this intermediate phase. Rather than having their identity come first and define their transition, why can't we let it be symbiotic and let the identity and the transition process influence and inform each other? Some people are going to be trans and still be gender non-conforming. Some people are going to be trans and be very gender conforming. Some people are going to flip between the two. Some people are fully gender non-conforming, but transition is just not the right thing for them, and trying to force them into a non-binary identity or a trans identity, or not even forcing, just strongly suggesting that they should consider that they might be one of those things, could be a bit, unnecessary and frustrating for that person. So just some ideas I've been having. Like I said, I've kind of focused a lot of my feelings about gender throughout this whole process. If you watched this whole video, thank you so much. I know it's long and it's just me talking about myself a lot, which to be fair is, my favorite topic to talk about. Honestly, as long as you're respectful, I'm extremely open to comments and questions about anything, whether it's about my past videos, my identity, sexual, body changes, or whatever. Leave a comment down below, and as long as it's respectful, I will answer it. Thank you so much. Feel free to share this video around, but also, don't use me as like anti-trans propaganda, because that is literally not what I am about. I am still pro-trans and all of that lovely stuff. I just can't help it that I'm such a fabulous faggot. Bye!